Picture this. Vladimir Putin spent months crafting a master plan. A spring offensive so ambitious, so meticulously designed that the Kremlin believed it would break Ukraine once and for all. Elite paratrooper divisions had been assembled. Hundreds of armored vehicles were staged and ready. A massive logistics network fed from the Luhansk border was fully operational. The targets were set. The orders were written. All that remained was the signal to attack. And then before a single order had been given, the entire plan collapsed. Not from the front Putin was watching. Not from the direction he was guarding from the south. From a counteroffensive that Ukraine had been quietly preparing for months. And what happened next did not just disrupt Russia's spring campaign. It may have permanently altered the trajectory of this war. Let us start from the beginning. By late 2025, Russian forces had been making worrying progress along a stretch of the front line where the eastern edges of Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts meet. According to assessments from that period, 3 combined arms armies from Russia's eastern contingent had pushed deep into Ukrainian defensive positions along this junction. One of them, the 5th Combined Arms Army, had crossed the Nyloya Yelenets River, captured Heliopol, and was continuing to advance toward Orikhiv. Another, the 36th Combined Arms Army, had crossed north of Heliopol. Russian command reportedly announced plans as early as December 29, 2025, to link the Orikhiv and Heliopol axes in order to advance towards Zaporizhia city itself, a strategic and industrial hub of 700,000 people. Think about what that would mean if Russian forces managed to approach Zaporizhia city from both east and west, bypassing Ukraine's heavily fortified defensive lines. The entire political and strategic dynamic of the war would shift dramatically. It would give the Kremlin enormous leverage at any negotiating table, and it would represent a catastrophic failure of Ukrainian defensive planning. But here's where it gets interesting. Ukraine saw it coming, and they had a plan. On January 29, 2026, Ukrainian air assault forces launched coordinated counterattacks on 2 interconnected axes, the Orikhiv sector in eastern Dnipropetrovsk Oblast and the Heliopol sector in eastern Zaporizhia Oblast. The objective, as later confirmed by military officials, was clear and deliberate: disrupt Russian forces, push them beyond their main defensive lines, and derail preparations for Russia's spring campaign before it could gain full momentum. And that is exactly what they did. The commander-in-chief personally visited the southern operational area as the operation unfolded, holding direct one-on-one meetings with assault group commanders and airborne unit leaders. He listened to their reports, assessed the situation himself, and then he made it official. As was confirmed in early March, speaking to reporters and later publishing his remarks, since the start of the operation, Ukrainian forces had regained control of over 400 square kilometers of territory. He noted, and this is crucial, that for the first time since 2024, when Ukraine conducted the Kursk offensive operation, Ukrainian troops in 1 month regained control over a larger area of Ukrainian land than the enemy captured during the same period. Read that again. For the first time in almost 2 years, Ukraine took back more than it lost in a single month. By March 26th, the Air Assault Forces Command confirmed updated figures. 9 settlements had been liberated, 7 in Dnipropetrovsk region, 2 in Zaporizhia. 3 additional settlements had been fully cleared of Russian forces, and the total territory reclaimed had reached approximately 440 to 470 square kilometers, depending on the methodology used. Conservative mapping confirmed at least 334 square kilometers, while acknowledging the actual figure was likely higher. Let us put that in perspective. 470 square kilometers is larger than many Ukrainian districts. In a war that has been fought for most of its duration over fields measured in meters and streets measured in blocks, this is staggering. But the territory itself is not the whole story, not even close. Here is where it becomes brilliant. The Russian losses in this operation were devastating, not just in numbers, but in strategic composition. According to figures published by Ukraine's air assault forces on March 26th, Russian forces suffered 3,676 casualties since January 29th alone. Of those, 2,653 were confirmed killed, 1,023 wounded, and 11 captured. Ukrainian forces also destroyed 565 units of Russian equipment and weaponry, including 8 tanks, 13 armored combat vehicles, 250 artillery systems, and 141 motor vehicles. Beyond that, 1,283 Russian drones and 140 drone control stations were eliminated. Those are not figures from a skirmish. That is the numerical expression of an army being systematically dismantled. And the Kremlin's nightmare did not stop there. The Russian military command, faced with mounting losses and a collapsing southern front line, made a decision that will be studied in military academies for years. They blinked. In early March 2026, the Russian command began laterally redeploying its most valuable, most irreplaceable units, elite airborne forces, naval infantry brigades from Donetsk Oblast to the south. According to assessments from March 7th, elements of the 76th Airborne Division were redeployed south of Orikhiv. The 336th Naval Infantry Brigade was shifted toward the Huliapol and Orikhiv lines. Elements of the 68th Army Corps, including the 39th Motorized Rifle Brigade, were pulled from the Pokrovsk and Toretsk tactical areas and sent south. Even elements of the 40th Naval Infantry Brigade of the Pacific Fleet were moved to Varvarivka and surrounding positions. And according to the spokesperson for Ukraine's Southern Defense Forces, those units had already suffered heavy losses after their redeployment. These were not random reserve brigades. These were the units Russia had spent months prepositioning for its spring-summer offensive against the fortress belt. These were the chess pieces Putin had arranged for his great offensive gamble, and now they were being pulled back in a panic to plug a hole in the south. Think about it in chess terms. You have spent the entire opening building toward a decisive attack with your queen, and then mid-game you are forced to pull her back to defend your own pieces. You do not just lose your offensive momentum, you reveal to everyone watching that your position was weaker than it appeared. Now, what exactly is the fortress belt, and why does this redeployment matter so much? The fortress belt is a 50-kilometer chain of 4 heavily fortified cities running north to south along the H-20 highway in Donetsk Oblast, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Drushkivka, and Kostantinivka. Their combined pre-war population exceeded 380,000 people. These are not mere towns. These are cities with deep defensive infrastructure, layered fortifications built since 2014, pre-registered artillery zones, and defenders who know every street and kill corridor. The fall of the fortress belt would open direct routes west toward Kharkiv, Dnipro, and Zaporizhia, which is precisely why it has long been described as a multi-year effort that would cost Russia enormous time, manpower, and resources. Russia tried to seize the fortress belt in 2014. It failed. It tried again in 2022. It failed. And now in the 5th year of the war, the Kremlin had bet on a spring-summer 2026 offensive to finally crack this line. Putin's forces intensified mechanized and motorized assaults starting March 17th. Over 600 attacks were recorded between March 17th and 20th alone, according to Frontline reports. As was confirmed on March 19th, over 500 Russian infantrymen surged toward Lyman on dozens of armored vehicles, motorcycles, and all-terrain vehicles. What was described as a battalion-sized mechanized assault considerably larger than most Russian operations in recent months unfolded, yet the attacks were thwarted on all fronts. The assessment remains brutally blunt. Russian forces are unlikely to capture Ukraine's fortress belt in 2026. And remarkably, even Russia's own political establishment is beginning to acknowledge this reality. The chairman of Russia's State Duma Defense Committee, not a Ukrainian official, not a Western analyst, but a Russian parliamentarian, publicly stated that it is still too early to speak of a victorious spring offensive. He admitted that fighting in Kostantinivka was complicated by the city's size and Ukraine's defensive fortifications. When a Kremlin insider manages expectations this aggressively, the situation on the ground must be dire indeed. Let us now look at the tactical dimension because the drone warfare component of this story is one that every serious defense analyst is tracking closely. Ukraine's operational success in the south was not purely a function of manpower or firepower. It was drone dominance. Ukrainian FPV drone operators systematically hunted down Russian mechanized units as they attempted to advance across the open steppe terrain of eastern Zaporizhia. The vast flat landscape became a killing field for Russian armored columns. A Ukrainian border guard reported that in sectors where Russian forces could not muster sufficient numbers. They attempted to compensate using inexpensive fixed-wing FPV drones. But it was not enough to breach what commanders on the ground were calling the drone wall. Even Russia's own military bloggers were forced to make stunning admissions. As reported on March 26th, a prominent Kremlin-affiliated military blogger acknowledged that Ukrainian drones were completely blocking Russian logistics, both on the front line and in the immediate rear in the direction of Zaporizhia. That is not propaganda. That is a confession from within Russia's own information ecosystem. And it explains why even Russia's most elite units, the very forces sent south to stabilize the situation, found themselves unable to hold their ground. Elements of the 14th Spetsnaz Brigade affiliated with Russia's GRU military intelligence were drawn into the chaos near Zerbyanki and Velika Mykolivka. Drone teams from motorized rifle regiments operated near Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. None of them could stop Ukraine's advance. Even elite Spetsnaz could not defeat the drone wall. And the Ukrainian president, meanwhile, was tracking the broader numbers. Despite Russia mobilizing between 40,000 and 43,000 people every month, it was losing up to 35,000 to 45,000 troops every 4 weeks through battlefield casualties, desertions, and the effectiveness of Ukrainian drone technology. The commander-in-chief added that Russian battlefield losses had exceeded the number of new recruits for 3 consecutive months. The math is brutal for Moscow. You can mobilize, you can train, you can deploy, but if you are consistently losing more than you are gaining, the equation only ends one way. Now, let us widen the lens to the full frontline picture because this is not a story being told on one axis alone. On the Lyman direction, Russia's primary pressure point for the fortress belt, the spokesperson for Ukraine's 11th Corps reported that Russian forces were launching 7 to 8 attacks per day. But Ukrainian drone operators were maintaining their positions on the high ground east of Sloviansk, systematically targeting Russian forces in the low-lying areas below. In Kupiansk, Russian infiltrations were confirmed in certain sections of the city, estimated at between a squad and a platoon in strength. But the spokesperson for the Ukrainian Joint Forces Task Force was emphatic. These scattered groups did not alter territorial control. Contrary to Russian military blogger claims that Kupiansk had fallen, it was stated clearly that it was too early to say all Russian soldiers had been eliminated, but that Ukrainian control had not changed. In Luhansk Oblast, Ukraine's partisan network struck where the front line could not. A partisan group disabled a railway relay cabinet near the city of Luhansk, a critical logistics artery for Russian forces supplying Kupiansk and Lyman. The attack directly impacted ammunition and spare parts deliveries. It was quiet, surgical, and devastating in its precision. And back in the south, the liberation of the village of Pyatakaki marked a symbolic and operational climax. On March 26th, Ukraine's Air Assault Forces Command officially announced that the village located southeast of Orikhiv had been liberated and a Russian salient had been eliminated. The head of the General Staff's main operational directorate confirmed that Ukrainian forces had liberated nearly the entire Dnipropetrovsk region affected by the fighting. Only 3 small settlements remained to be fully secured, and 2 more required clearing operations. Almost the entire region liberated. Now, let us address the Kremlin's political calculations because this is where the strategic stakes become truly clear. Russia knows its forces cannot seize the fortress belt on the battlefield in 2026. And so the Kremlin is doing what it always does when military objectives become unreachable. It tries to extract them through diplomacy instead. Russia is now demanding that Ukraine formally cede the unoccupied parts of Donetsk Oblast, not because Russian forces are close to capturing them, but precisely because they are not. According to analysts, the Kremlin's demand is designed to save Russia the personnel and material resources it would need for a military capture and to position Russia more advantageously for a possible future reinvasion. Let that sink in. Russia is demanding Ukraine surrender territory that Russia cannot militarily capture, and Ukraine's southern counteroffensive is why that demand has been laid bare for what it is, an admission of battlefield failure dressed up as a negotiating position. A Kiev-based analyst put it directly. The Kremlin, he said, is utterly displeased from a morale standpoint because their confidence that they are pushing along the entire front line is falling apart. That is not the language of a winning power. That is the language of an army whose master plan has been intercepted and neutralized. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian president warned that despite battlefield successes, Russia's next phase would target civilian infrastructure. Between the nights of March 25th and 26th, Russia launched 153 unmanned aerial vehicles, approximately 100 of them Shahid-type drones. Ukraine's Air Force shot down 130 of them. But the president warned publicly that Russia was preparing new operations targeting Ukraine's water supply systems. Civilian infrastructure once again as a weapon of war. It is the Kremlin's playbook when the battlefield fails. If you cannot break the front line, try to break the civilian population behind it. It has not worked before, and Ukraine's air defense, now shooting down drones at a rate that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago, is making it progressively harder. Now, let us pull back for the final assessment. And it is important to have the full picture, the honest picture, not just the victories. The southern operation was not a counteroffensive in the classic sense. Commanders in the field described it as a series of counterattacks aimed at stabilizing the line and clearing Russian infiltrations rather than achieving a breakthrough for territorial gains. And there were real costs. To carry out these counterattacks, Ukraine redeployed units that had been defending the northern outskirts of Pokrovsk. That allowed Russian forces to push a new offensive toward Donetsk. The situation north of Pokrovsk continued to gradually worsen through mid-March, even as the south improved. A Finland-based military analyst described it clearly. The operation seemed aimed at improving Ukraine's tactical position. Once the remaining areas are cleared, he said, Ukraine will likely try to solidify the line to the best of its abilities. This was not a war-ending breakthrough. It was a masterfully executed tactical operation with significant strategic consequences. Those consequences are real, documented, and profound. Russia's Dnipro group of forces halted its offensive near Orikhiv and south of Zaporizhia. The corridor towards Zaporizhia city, a goal Russian command had been designing since December 2025, has been closed. Elite airborne and naval infantry forces are pinned in the south, unavailable for the Fortress Belt campaign. Russia's spring offensive has launched without the mass it needs to succeed. And Ukraine has demonstrated once again that asymmetric innovation, above all drone dominance, can offset manpower disadvantages in ways that no one fully anticipated when this war began. As one military expert noted, Ukraine's southern operation produced tactical, operational, and strategic effects. It was said that these counterattacks are generating effects that may disrupt Russia's spring-summer 2026 offensive campaign plan. The goal was consolidation rather than conquest, but the consolidation achieved has strategic weight that goes far beyond its modest territorial framing. 9 liberated settlements, over 11,000 Russian troops taken out of action, approximately 440 to 470 square kilometers reclaimed, Russia's most elite units redirected in crisis, the Fortress Belt offensive launched at diminished strength, and the Kremlin now seeking at the negotiating table what it cannot achieve on the battlefield. This operation in the south may go down as the critical turning point that sets the pace of the war for the remainder of 2026. In the 5th year of this conflict, Ukraine is not merely holding ground. It is striking back. It is disrupting the enemy's campaign before it can launch. And it is forcing Moscow into the worst possible strategic position, reactive, overextended, and publicly unable to deliver on the promises Putin made to his own people. The words of the commander-in-chief remain the most precise summary of where things stand. The liberation of Ukrainian territory continues. Not a wish, but a documented reality backed by verifiable data from the front lines. Before closing, it is worth zooming out even further because the implications of what happened in the South in March 2026 extend well beyond the immediate front line. They speak to something deeper about the nature of this war, about the limits of Russian military doctrine, and about how Ukraine has evolved as a fighting force over 5 years of full-scale conflict. When this war began in February 2022, the conventional wisdom in many Western capitals was that Ukraine had days, perhaps weeks, before Russian forces would overwhelm Kiev. The numerical asymmetry was stark. Russia's military budget dwarfed Ukraine's. Its tank fleet, its artillery reserves, its air power, all of it seemed overwhelming on paper. And yet, here we are in the spring of 2026, in the 5th year of that war, with Ukraine not only surviving, but executing operational-level maneuvers that are forcing Russia's Supreme Command to make reactive panic decisions. How did we get here? Part of the answer is Western support, the long-range missiles, the armored vehicles, the financial mechanisms that kept Ukraine's war economy functioning. But Western support alone does not explain it. The deeper answer is Ukrainian adaptability. When Starlink was disrupted in early February 2026, an event that sent shockwaves through Ukrainian communications infrastructure, Russian commanders reportedly expected the counteroffensives in the south to falter. They did not. Ukrainian units adapted. Fiber optic drones replaced GPS-guided systems in critical sectors. Drone operators from various assault formations photographed testing new systems on the front lines were already fielding next-generation equipment. This is the pattern that has defined Ukraine's approach throughout the war. Every time Russia finds an advantage, mass drone attacks, electronic warfare, Starlink disruption, Ukraine finds a workaround. And while Russia's workarounds tend to be expensive and slow, throwing more men and more material at a problem, Ukraine's workarounds tend to be ingenious and fast. Consider the drone numbers. Russian forces deployed over 1,200 of them in the Orkhiv direction during this operation alone. Ukrainian forces destroyed every single one that was tracked and also dismantled 140 drone control stations along with them. That is not a defensive posture. That is systematic deconstruction of Russia's aerial infrastructure at the operational level. And this matters enormously as we look ahead. The fortress belt battles are not going to be decided by tanks alone or even by artillery. They are going to be decided by which side can sustain drone production, drone deployment, and drone targeting superiority over weeks and months of grinding urban combat. In Pokrovsk, a town with a pre-war population of just 60,000, it took Russian forces nearly 2 years to complete their capture. The fortress belt is several times larger than Pokrovsk. To capture all 4 cities, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Drushkivka, and Koshtinivka, the Kremlin might need hundreds of thousands of additional troops and an equivalent quantity of military equipment. That is an ask that strains even Russia's mobilization capacity. And here is the detail that every observer of this war should hold on to. Russia's mobilization mathematics are already failing. Russia is mobilizing 40,000 to 43,000 per month, but losing 35,000 to 45,000 per month to casualties and desertions. If those figures are even approximately accurate, Russia is running on a treadmill, spending enormous political capital on mobilization just to stay even while absorbing catastrophic losses that have now for 3 consecutive months exceeded new recruit numbers. This is not a military machine at the peak of its strength. This is a military machine under structural strain, making increasingly desperate strategic gambles, and now finding that even its most elite forces, the airborne paratroopers, the naval infantry, are being consumed by a front line that refuses to collapse. And the Ukrainian partisan dimension, quiet but strategically significant, adds another layer to this analysis. The railway strike near Luhansk was not an isolated event. It reflects a broader pattern of deep rear disruption that Ukraine has been developing throughout the war. When you can hit a logistics relay cabinet hundreds of kilometers from the front line and disrupt ammunition supply chains to entire sectors, you are fighting a different kind of war than Russia planned for. You are making Russia's occupied territories ungovernable and unsustainable in ways that no artillery barrage can fully counter. It was also noted that Ukrainian counterattacks had forced Russian command to deal with significant communications and command problems, particularly after the Starlink disruption affected both sides' ability to coordinate. The situation for one Russian army was illustrative.